Blood satellite.
Let's move on. That was kind of a break. I wanted to segue a bit cleaner into this, but I wanted to discuss a book that I've actually mentioned before in a previous episode. I forget which one. We discussed this book, but we didn't discuss it in full, and I think it connects neatly to a lot of things that we've discussed previously, and it's going to connect very well with where we go from here. But the book is titled The Therapeutic State, and it's written by Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-S-Z. I don't know how you say that. I want to say Szasz. Anyway, The Therapeutic State, Psychiatry in the Mirror of Current Events is the subtitle. Now I might have spoiled this book a bit before, but this is written by a psychiatrist, written by like Thomas Szasz, here we go, is a professor of psychiatry at the State University of New York Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. He's a life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, a life member of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and a recipient of many honors, among them the Humanist of the Year Award of the American Humanist Association in 1973. So this guy is a psychologist. He is a psychiatrist. Despite this, he wrote a book that is intensely critical of psychiatry, and is intensely critical of what he calls the therapeutic state. Now, on a previous episode, you might recall us use the term the medicalization of penalization. And I'm once again going to make the dad joke that that's not what it sounds like. But he's talking about something that we often talk about in the scene, which is sort of the criminalization of thought, or the criminalization of like hate, and the psychoanalysis of, people who hold heterodox thoughts and how that grafts onto the legal system. So like how you can be imprisoned for hate speech, how you can be imprisoned for being atypical in your beliefs. And I thought the book, we covered a couple points, but I'm going to kind of go through the details here because he makes a lot of points that I think you would agree with.
I look upon the mental health profession today as a gigantic apparatus of molestation.
Molestation? That's a loaded word.
Yeah.
How do you mean it?
Intrusive.
What's interesting is he traces the world we live in right now is so defined by psychoanalysis in so many ways, and I'm reminded of this. I'm curious to hear if you have experienced this, because you're literally married to a woman as well. But I find that my wife, she consumes Instagram a lot, she consumes social media a lot, and it seems that every female influencer believes they're a psychologist. Have you noticed that?
Yes, I have. It's almost without thinking. It's so weird.
It's been so ingrained into the female psyche, which itself is almost a psychoanalytic thing to say. But
I remember in high school, and like you had girls in high school to be like, "Oh, I'm BPD. Oh, I'm actually. Did you know I'm actually this?" Like all this self-diagnosis. Like it starts really young, like that, like late 90s, and you've already got girls in their teens who are talking in psychological terms. Like, where did you learn this shit? You don't watch Law and Order? Like, I don't know where this is coming from.
Or they'll say like everything's gaslighting now. You've known that. Like you're making me lose my mind. For the people who don't know, that's what gaslighting means. Gaslighting means you make someone break from reality and make them go insane. And according to your average woman, that happens to them 3 times a day. The argument that he's made, the arc of the book, is about how we have replaced what was traditionally known as morality with psychoanalysis, that we don't have any sense of morality, and that left a gaping hole in our civilization, specifically the American civilization or the North American civilization. We don't permit religious, any sort of morality from religion or anywhere else, but we need something. So psychiatry stepped in as the moral arbiter.
He prefers to refer to the psychological distress that manifests itself in what we would call depression and anxiety as problems in living, arguing that psychiatric conditions are not viral or pathogenic in a way that a bloodborne or organismic disease is. Instead, Szasz addresses how the challenges of playing by the rules of socially designed behavioral games can result in psychological suffering and manifest in conditions severe enough to bring an individual, or to have an individual be brought, to a psychiatrist's office. He also says that the emotion-laden behaviors and complaints of psychological pain from individuals in distress is really just a form of bodily communication when linguistic communication fails to address the problems in living that the individual is experiencing.
The first thing he establishes in the book is something that I agree with, and I think we've said before, which is like if you're like, what is the insanity defense? The insanity defense is a strange phenomena in the legal structure, right? The idea that you can commit a crime, but if they can prove you're insane or not in sound mind, you're less guilty than if you were a rational mind. And without even reading these books, without doing any sort of research, you can start to pick that apart logically. For example, if you shoot someone, if you kill someone, and you say, oh, well, that person, they were bipolar, they were in a mental health crisis. I'm like, well, does that mean that people who are mentally unwell are more violent by their nature? And these people will say no. Well, then what does that mean? Like, if you're trying to, for you to excuse that, that would mean that violence is just part of their affliction. But you also don't want to admit that violence is part of any mental health affliction. So if that's the case, then that means that that person had a mental health affliction, but was also violent. That the violent act could be committed irrespective of whether or not they're bipolar, or have borderline personality disorder, or have depression, or whatever it is. Because if you blame the violent act on depression, that means everyone with depression is more likely to commit a violent act. And that might be the case, but if you won't admit that, then really all we have is a legal structure, and all we should have is a legal structure that judges your actions. You killed someone, you're put on trial. It doesn't matter how sane or insane you are. So he says here, to psychology, the belief in mental illness is like the religious belief in God. You cannot prove it, but denying it is heterodox. That's a bold statement, right? And his position is psychiatrists don't even really know what mental illness is. And he'll make a lot of claims in the book that might sound outrageous, but I'm coming around to it, because he had said, no one really knows really definitively what, schizophrenia is. We have a cluster of behaviors, but it's actually pretty ill-defined. Now, I want to preface that by saying that
I think you just need to look at how often they edit those books to come to an understanding that they don't have a very clear understanding of it. Yeah. What's the name of the textbook they have?
Yeah, and I don't want to go down a road where I'm saying depression doesn't exist, or that there are people who have serious, for one reason or another, psychological breaks. I can believe that people can just imagine voices, and if you talk to schizophrenic people, you can get into their delusions. If you can listen to talk, you can talk to schizophrenics all the fucking time. They upload their own videos on YouTube. Go find a schizophrenic video right now where they claim that the mailman is stalking them. So you can tell something's going on here, and it's infecting their life, and that they're not doing it just because they think it's fun. I get that. However, his case is more that, I'll get into his case right now. He's got this one line here that I like. He said, and again, bold statement, he says, the direct connection of psychological issues to chemical imbalances is incorrect. He says it's mostly environmental or moral. He says physical imbalances should manifest in different ways. That it then makes personality characteristics like diseases.
Western culture, urbanization, the problem of paupers, of poor people, vagrants, the growth of cities. And what do you do with the problem of mental illness has always been and continues to be, in a nutshell, I'm oversimplifying now, but this is the core problem of people in society who can't make it, who are somehow outside of it. And this is captured very nicely in the old-fashioned English term, alienation. They are alienated, and the doctors were called alienists. This is what it is about.
So he's saying a lot of these behaviors that people get, that they're afflicted by, aren't necessarily chemical imbalances, not on the extreme end. He says a lot of them can be just like trauma. Like you can get traumatized into like not being able to sleep and stuff. He's like, a lot of the stuff can be environmental. A lot of the stuff can be, you know, the food you're eating and things like that. But rarely is it a true chemical imbalance. And you see this with the medication. Like if they detect that you have a chemical imbalance, they kind of have a one size fits all strategy to just suppress your mind entirely. And it seems that, you know, you're just introducing gradations of making people catatonic, whereas, you know, in the past it would be the lobotomy. It's like, well, a lot of these medications are in effect chemical lobotomies. They're just a bit softer, but it's the same one size fits all option to problems that you don't really understand. And he gives this great visual example that I love. I always think back to this. He's like, you know, if this science were so well defined, then we wouldn't have the situation where you're in a courtroom, you know, trying someone who's on trial for murder and have dueling psychiatrists. One side saying that he's sane, one side saying that he's insane. Like that shouldn't happen. It should be if it was actually that scientific, but it seems like it's more opinion based. And all you gotta do is look at, you know, your average trial where insanity is on the table. It's like, yeah, you could have dueling psychiatrists. It's kind of funny that happens. He says, over the past 300 years since modern psychiatry emerged, we have witnessed the medicalization of penalization, extending the reach of the state and imprisonment, the extension of medicine over morals and law, the goal of Sigmund Freud and others. So that's like the psychiatric state, the psychiatric movement taking precedence over law. And I think if you look at our current legal system, that seems obvious. It seems that psychiatrists hold like this special position in society even still, and we've just adopted their language into our own daily lives where we are always psychoanalyzing each other. And that's fucking crazy. The idea that the rate at which your average person psychoanalyzes not only everyone around them but themselves. Like that's no way to fucking live. And he says, furthermore, that mental illness is often used as a way to infringe on the civil rights of offenders and is a safe way to shuffle them into a space where they have no rights or control. And this was actually explained by Foucault, not to just circle back to that raving queer, but that's in effect what he was saying. It's like, it's just a place where you kind of stick the people that are inconvenient, that you can't really explain, but you don't really want to deal with. And that's what the asylum system was. And if I don't get to this later, he makes a point in the book that I think people should always keep in mind. That the event is the deinstitutionalization movement, right? So there's this really interesting movie, a documentary that I saw years and years ago, and I think you can find it on streaming services right now. It's called Cropsey. And it starts as a story about this guy who was tried for murder, I think murdering a girl. He was like a vagrant, and then it's about sort of the mythology of the small town about this creature named Cropsey. But what it ends up being about really is the deinstitutionalization movement in the 80s, I believe, where all these asylums emptied out all of their inmates, all of their patients. And you hear this brought up in the culture from time to time, where it's like, oh, we have all these like crazy people on the streets, they should be in asylums. That's where they used to be, in asylums. It's true. But he makes a point where it's like, you know, the deinstitutionalization movement was not interpreted as what it should have been and what it was, which was the psychiatric movement admitting that they didn't know what they were doing. Like the entire saying that we're going to institutionalize all these people, they basically admitted that they were wrong and just released them into the wild. His position on that was that, well, you know, first of all, you shouldn't have institutionalized most of these people to begin with, but once you did institutionalize them, you can't just release them because they don't know how to exist in society again. So he's like, well, what you probably should have done is kept them institutionalized till they died and then just stopped then. But it's a double-edged sword if you just release them and now they're just these fucking insane wandering vagrants, right? But back to the main point, which is that, you know, the deinstitutionalization movement isn't seen for what it really was, which was this whole thing admitting that it was wrong, right? Like you shouldn't just force people into these like weird the nightmare hospitals forever, right? And he makes another point on that same sort of uptick that says how the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, always embraced psychiatric imprisonment as a form of social control, which is interesting. The civil liberties movement, right? You think that they would be advocating for your rights as an American citizen, but they were always the first ones who were on the side of psychiatric imprisonment. And there's two main guys who were the main proponents of this. One was named Dr. Menninger, and the other was named Dr. Clark. They're the two forces in American society, he says, that were driving this adoption of sort of medicalized penalization, or creating a parallel prison system, in effect. And he states that the ACLU is an ideological and economic captive of the liberal medical psychiatric establishment that prioritizes health over liberty. I think that's the center of his argument, that they're prioritizing health over liberty is a slippery slope. And that's how eventually you give total authority to these doctors that don't really know what the fuck they're doing.
It's an epidemic of psychiatry that we are dealing with. We don't have an epidemic of mental illness, we have an epidemic of psychiatry. You eat too much, it's a disease, it's an addiction. You smoke too much, it's a disease. You are too unhappy, it's a disease. You're too thin, it's a disease. You're too fat, it's a disease. You have too little sex, it's a disease. You have too much sex, it's a disease. No free will, it's all chemicals. No self-discipline, no self-control.
And he frames it like this. This is how he views it. This is kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about crime. He says, mental illness is taken seriously if the threat is to oneself or to others. But he says if it's a threat to others, then it's a crime that's punishable by law. And if you're a threat to yourself, that's not a crime. Now, there might be some people who have strong opinions about that, but, you can, if someone wants to eat themselves to death, that's not a crime. You can't really impose on that person if they want to fucking run their life into the ground or act like a madman. He said, if illness cannot be a crime, then crime cannot be an illness. So he's just rejecting this marriage of using mental illness in weighting crime, period. Now, what do you think about that? Because that's really the point I'm making. Would you agree with that or disagree with that?
I don't want to pick nits about it, but I think that eating yourself to death can be a crime. But I think it's the way that you view the state and civilization. So it's a whole tangent. But I think generally what he's saying, like, look, if you want to take crime as it is currently and say that we can medicalize that and call crime an illness, no. If illness as it exists, like alcoholism, can't be called a crime, or just being a fucking jerk isn't a crime, then no, you shouldn't be making crimes illnesses. I agree.
He makes this other point. This is what I think about quite a bit, because I never considered this before. Because when you think of mental health, you think of schizophrenia. You might think, okay, well, a lot of this mental illness stuff is wishy-washy at best and ill-defined, but at the very least, there's schizophrenia as this. But we don't, we see that, right? But he says at the core of the psychiatric profession sits schizophrenia, the most extreme and debilitating mental illness. He said, at the turn of the 19th century, it was most common to see mental illness blamed on physical illness. Like with syphilis, syphilis would rot your mind. There's a lot of famous figures who had syphilis that went insane, and like Al Capone was, I believe, a interesting case of that. Tom Hardy actually did a movie about that. Oh, a very strange movie. I don't know the name, but look up Tom Hardy, Al Capone movie. It's actually just following him in the final year of his life when he's on house arrest in his mansion. The FBI has seized all his assets. They're trying to locate Al Capone's secret stash of money, because Al Capone was rumored to have this money that he buried somewhere. The FBI wants it. Problem is, Al Capone is riddled with syphilis and losing his fucking mind. He's wandering around his mansion, pissing and shitting himself and getting into fights with plants. And the movie is just that. It's a very strange, not a rewarding movie, but give it a shot if you want to see Tom Hardy as like a man whose brain is rotting out of his fucking ears and eye sockets, and as the FBI's like, Mr. Capone, are you okay? Where's the gold? Like, why does the FBI just want, like, it's not even that much probably, but anyway. But the point is that syphilis was always, or some physical ailment was the cause of a mental impairment. But he said, but through schizophrenia, it shifted. Through schizophrenia, it turned into a study and treatment of misbehavior, since no physical issue could be found. So that's the thing, like, you would judge misbehavior as a result of mental illness, and then mental illness as some kind of physical or perhaps even environmental cause, maybe even trauma, but something like that. But with schizophrenia, they started studying misbehavior or social maladjustment as the thing you're treating in itself. You're not trying to treat the cause. That is the cause. Misbehavior is the cause. And that is an important shift. And I think that's the world we live in right now, where mental illness is seen as the cause of other things. You just have mental illness as if it were a tumor, not that it's caused by something that you can fix. You know, then you remove, there's no cure for mental illness, so we've accepted that, because, you know, even with syphilis, you're like, well, it's terminal, but we know what it is. With a lot of these other mental illnesses, as we accept them, the only thing we can do is conduct ongoing permanent treatment, you know, evolving treatments, you know, for these things that they might not even negatively impact their lives. It's just seen now as socially maladjusted. And he says schizophrenia is actually just a cluster of systems, and the name schizophrenia itself comes from divided mind. That's the root phrase there. And it's treated as a perfected mind that's been corrupted either by disease or by mental illness, whereas the author just sees it as a developmental problem, the same way he says schizophrenia is a developmental problem, the same way as homelessness or competence. Now, I don't know if I agree with that, but I like it. You know what I mean? Like, you're schizophrenic in the same way that you're like a homeless junkie. You know, like there's something wrong with you, or it's like, it's not something that you're infected by. It's like a cluster of symptoms, and you're just like he would make the argument that you're actually just like morally repugnant. Now, and I don't know if I agree with this, but I'm going to state it. My wife actually I think she brought this to my attention. I'm going to give her credit, but someone at some point had said that they never known a good person to get Alzheimer's. Now, that's a big claim. But I was thinking about it, like is Alzheimer's just, yeah, like do the people get Alzheimer's? They tend to be just like bitter, shitty people in life, and then like how many good people get Alzheimer's? Like, I don't know. Like, I'd have to think about it, and I put that to the listeners, because that might be something that just hasn't been thought about. But he's kind of making the claim that, you know, a lot of these maladies might be that you're a quote unquote bad person. And a lot of people will throw sand on that because it sounds too simple. But hey, I'd like to entertain that idea.
Yeah. For me, in my life, anecdotally, the schizophrenia, dementia, and Alzheimer's all track with people who, relatively speaking, led lives where they were a pain in the ass and people didn't like being around them. So
yeah. And another example he gives is hysteria, and this is another shift, another pivot that I thought was interesting. He says, let's take hysteria. Historically, hysteria was seen as someone who pretended to be sick, right? You're hysterical, you know, you got Munchausen syndrome, or, you know, it's all in your head, but you're kind of kooky, and, you know, it's the woman disease, right? But what Freud did was, when in the past people would dismiss it, like, oh, you're fucking hysterical. Okay, that means we don't need to take you seriously because it is all in your mind. However, what Freud said, that, you know, the desire to be seen as ill is illness itself. That if you have a desire to want to get attention that way, that itself is an illness. Now, he makes a point, and this is what I wanted to get to, that this process legitimized what were once seen as unserious conditions. And I think that legitimization of the unserious completely unbalanced our view of how society operates, because we can no longer say that anything is unimportant. Like you can draw a line right from this to the Me Too movement if you wanted to, about the legitimization of feelings, regardless of what those feelings are or how grounded in reality those feelings are. It's just, and I've listened to a lot of women especially, but I've listened to a lot of students of psychiatry. They'll speak to other psychiatrists or speak to each other, and they use the word feel a lot. It's like, oh, we don't like using definitive statements. We don't like using words that are too grounded or too forceful. Everything is about feelings. I feel this way, and I feel that the way you're feeling makes me feel this way. It's the legitimization of whatever the fuck you're feeling at all times. And that's no fucking way to have a society. That's no way to run your life. That's fucking crazy. You have to have the mechanisms to say, oh, these feelings matter, these feelings don't matter. But you're just saying that everything hysterical is valid. Like, Jesus Christ. Well, look where that gets us, right? And he's got a quote here. I believe it's from G.K. Chesterton. But this was in reference to what we were talking about in that previous episode, about how political killers and assassins, oftentimes they're like Lee Harvey Oswald and others, they try and get hit, or Sirhan, they try and pin them with the insanity defense, as if an insane person would shoot the president. He's got this, usually they're the most sane people, they're the most driven, the most focused. Like, why the president? Why not just anybody, right? He says, the madman is not a man who has lost his reason. The madman is someone who has lost everything except his reason. And I like that, because really, why not shoot the president? Like, if you have a problem with society, or if you have something wrong with what the president did, maybe it is rational that you shoot the president. I'm not advocating for shooting the president, but like, if you've lost every connection with social norms,
it's not an insane thing, is the point. Yeah, maybe it's completely irrational to, like, I shouldn't even fucking say this. I'm gonna figure out if I should delete this later. I'm like, it can be completely irrational to want to the CIA headquarters. Like, is it irrational to want to the NSA building? It's this division. Well, it's the whole thing about medicalization, right? It's putting a dividing line between what is good and right versus bad, and what is rational and sane versus irrational and insane. Like, you can't possibly believe that a sane person would want to do a bad thing, you know what I mean? Or that an insane person would want to do a good thing, the corollary of that. But the truth is that sometimes people who are totally sane and rational want to do bad things, and they have perfectly clear, cogent rationale for the horrible things that they want to do. And they're not insane, they're just bad people. It's a real thing, it exists.
Yeah, you bring up like good and bad, and that's a interesting way to look at it, that no matter how medicalized we get, we have to return to this understanding that there's good people and there's bad people, or there's a good action and a bad action in the broadest possible strokes. And he talks about this when he speaks of Dr. Menninger. Dr. Menninger, which was he was a big public advocate for this stuff. He said Dr. Menninger was a leading psychologist in the country and was instrumental in moving in a progressive direction from penal punishment to medical treatment. And this is his thing. He stated that everybody has mental illness, just to different degrees, and everyone should be treated. And this could be even described as ideological backing. But so you have to understand, like, the advocates for this, they don't think there's a sane person. Everyone's insane. There's just different types of insanity. So, and they are the arbiters of what level of insanity you are at.
Constant goal is the fact that these individuals who are misjudged and often disliked or feared by other people often have such great capabilities, so that I would say that maybe you could say a psychiatrist is somebody who is constantly aware that the stone rejected by the builders may become the head of the corner.
Consider that, like, you don't know what mental health is in that sense, though. Like, what is a mentally healthy person if everyone is mentally ill? So if you don't know what a healthy person is, how can you judge what illness is, right? He furthers this by saying, he says, the Constitution of the American Constitution was written in a conceptual and moral vacuum, creating a craving for moral order. Psychiatry and the medical establishment broadly moved into this role. That's his claim. And I think, you know, even if you disagree that the Constitution was written in a moral vacuum, it does seem that at some point the morality was found absent from it, and then psychiatry moved in to try and answer the question of how do we judge what is good or bad in a secular sense, in a secular liberal sense. In a secular liberal society, you could only have psychiatry. You can't have religion, you can't have spirituality, you can't have anything else. Certainly can't have tradition, right? And he's got an interesting story here. He's got a bunch of examples. There's a lot of great examples in this book. Let me just pull one up here. It was the case of Tennessee Williams. Tennessee Williams is a name a lot of people might know. I'll just read an excerpt here. He says, on February 24th, 1983, Tennessee Williams died in New York. On March 5th, 1983, he was buried in an elaborate Roman Catholic ceremony at St. Louis Cathedral. His body laid to rest in a consecrated ground of Cavalry Cemetery. He's finally going to be in a good St. Louis neighborhood, explained Tennessee Williams' younger brother, Dakin, who made the funeral arrangements. Now he's going to be near the right people. Although this was the funeral Dakin Williams wanted his brother to have, it was precisely the funeral his brother did not want. Tennessee Williams actually wrote, a codicil to my will provides for the disposition of my body in this way, sewn up in a clean white sack and dropped overboard 12 hours north of Havana, so that my bones may rest not too far from those of Hart Crane. This is what he actually wanted, but it was not afforded to him, because his brother just decided that, you know, Tennessee Williams was mentally ill when he was writing his will. Basically, the whole story was that Tennessee Williams didn't give any of his will to his brother, Dakin. And Dakin was making the case that Tennessee Williams wasn't in sound mind when he wrote the will. So he argued, despite Tennessee Williams writing this all down in his autobiography, writing it down in his will, his shit brother decided to be like, oh, well, I'm just going to convince them that you were mentally ill. So not only I get money, I'm going to have you buried where you want to be buried. He says, we live in a secular society, not in a theocracy. This is why involuntary psychiatric interventions do not violate the protections of the First Amendment, but involuntary religious interventions do. What then gives a Catholic priest the right to bury a man in a religious ceremony that the deceased did not want? Even if such a priest is not guilty of breaking the law, he is guilty of violating the ethic of respect for persons. It is one thing for Dakin Williams to try and deny his brother's autonomy, dignity, and identity. It's another thing for clergymen to cooperate in dishonoring a person under the guise of honoring him. So there's all these cases within the book where, like, famous people, you know, Lee Harvey Oswald and John Hinckley, them getting labeled as insane by the press while also fighting it the entire time. Like, all these cases are guys screaming, I'm not insane. This is what I want. This is what I want my funeral to be. This is why I shot these people. And then this entire establishment saying, he doesn't know what he's saying. But again, what point, like, what gives them the right? Like, what gives you the right to say that even an insane person can't advocate for themselves? Like, can a person with schizophrenia say, I burned that house down because I wanted to burn it down? It's like, he doesn't know why he did it. It doesn't matter why he did it. He's confessing to it. You don't get to just decide that that's not the reason why they did it. You see what I'm saying? And also, like, you know, the insanity defense of Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound is a great example in this book of a guy who was railroaded into over a decade of psychiatric care without giving them a trial. You know, this was a political prisoner who, and, you know, oftentimes these asylums are just places to put political prisoners and call them insane. And there was no reason to believe he was insane. And a great case he gave was the case of Jim Jones. Now, you remember Jim Jones as the guy who started that crazy church that led everyone into a mass suicide.
This is the site of Jonestown's open-air meeting hall, where I'm standing right now, where the Reverend Jim Jones led his followers into the worst mass murder and suicide pact in America's history. Only small golden flowers grow where bodies once lay. On that fateful morning, there were more than 940 people living in Jonestown. By nightfall, only 33 would still be alive.
He was deemed insane afterward, after the mass suicide. However, up until the moment of the suicide, he was seen as completely sane, regardless of his preaching, regardless of the things he was saying, because, the mass suicide seemed to logically follow from what he was saying. He was setting up a parallel society with his flock. He was being threatened, and he was saying to the world that they would rather kill themselves than be prisoners. And so that's what fucking happened, but he was never seen as insane until that moment, despite his liberal connections, because he was friends with the Clintons too. Jim Jones, and this is the thing they try and bury, just like Epstein, he was friendly with everybody. He was whining and dining with the Clintons, with every Democratic bigwig you could think of. They all love the guy. So how was he sane the entire time and only sane at the end? You don't get to just make those demarcations like that. They're either always insane or they actually weren't insane, and that was just like an extreme act, but the logical conclusion of everything leading up to that point. And also, I know we gotta get going soon. I just wanted to bring your attention to one page here. It's page 86. I don't want to read this whole thing, but it's you can kind of get where it's going from the title. The title is "Why Do We Fear the Retarded?"
Nice.
I just want to drop that there. One thing he advocates for in response to everything I just said about even your best wishes, like your best wishes in a will, even a will or an autobiography or whatever, falling victim to psychiatric attack. He says what we need to do is create a new type of will. He calls it a psychiatric will. It will need to be a specific type of legal document that functions like a regular will and establishes in sound mind one's own determination to not be committed to involuntary psychiatric care, which is an interesting idea. Imagine a legal document that says, no matter, I'm in sound mind right now, I can prove I'm of sound mind, I legally want to never be involuntarily committed. I would rather just be a trial. You can never accuse me of being insane later. However that document should be laid out. I think that's actually an interesting idea. That's like one less tool that can be used against you. Maybe that's because it's very rare that an insanity defense kind of works out for you, I think. Maybe it does if you're black, but the odds are if you're white, you're not going to be able to get away with an insanity defense anyway. This is just something that gets afforded to minorities anyway, right? Another thing he says, maybe we'll end on this. This is sort of what I was talking about with Jim Jones, you can't have temporary insanity. And that's sort of like a thing we accept in society, isn't it? That you can be temporarily insane. You can be temporarily not of sound mind. How the fuck does that happen? How does that work? He uses the example of Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst we covered this in the book Days of Rage many, many episodes ago. Famous case where a white heiress was kidnapped by a bunch of fucking militant communists and went from kidnapper to active participant in the group. And, after the fall of this group, she had a lot to answer for. Why did she side with the group and participate in their bank robberies and whatnot?
While Hearst's parents pleaded for her to come home, the SLA released a series of audio recordings confirming her kidnapping.
I'm making this tape to let you know that I'm still okay.
Just 2 months after her kidnapping, the SLA robbed a San Francisco bank. And there was Patricia Hearst, automatic rifle in hand, looking more like a gunman than a victim.
The impact of the photographs of Patty Hearst with the machine gun were in some ways even bigger than the kidnapping itself, because it established, or so it appeared, that Patty Hearst had gone over to the other side.
And they're trying to say, she was brainwashing, it was temporary insanity. But it's again, temporary insanity has no legal or scientific definition. They don't know what temporary insanity is. You can't just say someone's completely rational, then they just started behaving irrationally, and now they're okay. Well, how did they get better? They just got better on their own. They got better when they found out they weren't allowed to do the thing they were doing before. You know what I mean? Like, so she joined a communist militia and robbed banks and was just insane for that segment. How the fuck does that make sense? He says brainwashing, the entire concept of brainwashing, he says it's like perversion. People treated with disdain when they are in the light of reason, but they still do it. They still like, I'm brainwashed, but I still like doing this stuff. And if you look at Patty Hearst, you know, she never really disavowed. She never really disavowed anything that group was about. They just disavowed that they got caught. You know, it's just a way to get away with the crimes. Anyway, long story short, what he's trying to advocate for in the book is that, you know, the medicalization of these sorts of behaviors is bad. Either something is a crime in the traditional sense of a crime, that it harms someone or harms society. But if it's just odd behavior, like addiction, is addiction a crime? You know, does the fact that you're addicted to a substance when you commit a crime make you less culpable for the crime? He would say no. It's like you commit the crime. It doesn't matter if you're a fucking crack addict. You know, and also, what is addiction? And this is a debate we've had even in the chat. Like, well, what is addiction? Does it need to have a chemical component? Like, do you need to go through withdrawals when you quit it for it to be an addiction? Or can you be addicted to pornography? Can you be addicted to gambling? You know, is there a chemical reaction when you stop gambling? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but it's not like you sweat like with heroin withdrawal, right? So like, what even is addiction? We're not even on the same page with that. You know, I'm not even sure where I stand with that. My definition of addiction is just something that you compulsively do, even to the detriment of your own well-being. And maybe that's too medicalized. I don't know. But it just seems that, you know, I think we could agree gambling addiction exists. You know, that's different than crack addiction. But anyway, but the fact that, like, if you were a gambling addict and you shoot someone, the fact that you're a gambling addict shouldn't matter whether or not you kill them, right? So how does, you know, any other form of addiction lessen or strengthen just the act? Anyway, that's the case that's made in the book. What do you think about all that?
No, that's the big thing for me that I always come back to, is like, talking about the medicalization of it is sometimes almost a distraction. When you get into a court system, when you're talking about criminality, it should not matter why. Yeah, I don't like this whole thing. Like, it's the same thing we said before about victim impact statements. Ignore, I don't want this, get rid of that. And I don't care about motivations. Motivations aren't necessary. All that matters is, did you shoot her? If you shot her, you will be hung. That's it. That's all there is. I don't care about the rest. Maybe you had a really good reason. Maybe it was rational. Maybe it was irrational. Maybe you're insane. I don't care, because the fact that you shot a person means you're probably going to do it again. So, and also you deserve to pay. It's a punishment. It's a punishment, you know? So it none of this matters. I think, here's what I'll say. If you shoot somebody, let's say you commit a heinous crime, and the punishment for this heinous crime for a rational person is 30 years to life. If you committed that heinous crime and you don't even know why you committed it, and you're possibly just insane, you should just be executed immediately. I don't understand why that lessens your sentence. It should make it worse, because the chance of recidivism is so much higher for an insane person. Why should we pay for you to exist when we now through this medicalization accept that you aren't one of us? You aren't a person. You don't follow these rules, and you never will. Why are we keeping you alive? I can't understand.
Let's put it this way. His whole argument is grounded in the reintroduction of something like morality. Now let's give an example. Let's say you're an individual who's an alcoholic, and that you're chemically addicted to alcohol. Sure, and it's hard to quit drinking. I did it, but I know it's hard. You know, especially, but it's less hard if you have good reasons to do it, like if you have a family. Now let's say that you're an alcoholic, and because of your alcoholism, one of your children has an accident. They're under your watch. Let's say they fell into a pool, and because you were drunk, you didn't notice that they were drowning, and the child didn't die, but that child now has brain damage. And that was, you feel, and you can prove that that's because of your negligence due in one reason to another, because you were just blackout drunk when that happened, when you shouldn't have been. If you continue drinking after that, I do think that's a moral judgment on your character. If you know that your addiction, like if you know, oh, every time I smoke crack, I wander down the street and I start destroying property. I smoke meth and I get into fights and I steal and maybe I start molesting people, and you know that you do that. If you continue to do that, I think that is a moral, rational decision on your part. You have made the choice that antisocial behavior is acceptable within your moral framework. And I think that is a moral judgment on you. Just like, okay, if I know drinking and driving is bad, and I know I'm putting people's lives at risk, and maybe I've gotten into an accident before, so I'm not good at drinking and driving. Some people are just good at it. But if I made the decision to drink, and at some point a moral decision was made where, you know, like we talked about this before, that cops understand that if someone has broken into your house to commit a home invasion or a robbery, they have already made the mental calculation that your life is worth less than their desire for your property. So people will say that, like, oh, if you shoot an intruder, oh, so their life is worth more than your property. It's like, no. That person, by committing that act, has already made a moral judgment that your life is worth less than your property, which they want. Right? So it's like that's the moral internal calculation that happens anytime antisocial behavior is committed. So I think he is trying to rediscover the moral calculations that still exist within a mind that is plagued by addiction. And I think if you have overcome an addiction, like, here's the thing, like, because, you know, I don't drink anymore, and I, in a sense, I think I beat that aspect, you know, I can still be in trouble later in life, but like, it takes a lot for like an alcoholic to trick me. Like, I know all the bullshit, I know all the lies, I know, like, some people who don't understand how that mind works, they can get tricked by. I'm like, you can't fucking trick me. I know that you're more self-aware than you would like people to think. Like, you would probably want people to think like, it's a disease, I have a disease. No, you don't. You make a decision every single time you pick up that bottle, and that's uncomfortable for you, and I know that it's hard, but odds are every time you pick up that bottle, something fucking bad happens. If you know that every time you get drunk you beat your family and you still continue to drink, you've made a moral calculation that beating your family is either preferable or desirable. That's not a fucking disease. There's no beating your family disease. And anyway, that's I'm just rambling at this point, but anyway.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.